The HH Ferry route is a very old shipping route which connects Elsinore, Zealand, Denmark and Helsingborg, Scania, Sweden across the northern and narrowest part of the Øresund. The route is one of the world's most busy international car ferry routes, with around 70 daily departures from each harbour. Current traffic. The route is currently served by car ferry shipping line Scandlines and a smaller passenger shipping line known as Øresund. Scandlines ferries operate more than 70 daily departures from each port every 15 minutes for most of the day, and every 12 minutes during the peak summer weeks with an additional ferry. As the distance between Denmark and Sweden here only is around 2.5 nautical miles, the crossing time is just 20 minutes, while Øresund currently departs every hour with their only bus. Scandlines uses 4 ferries, MF Tycho Brahe, MS Aurora, MF Hamlet and MF Mercandia IV. The MF Mercandia 8 is available and used during the annual maintenance of the other ferries and during the July peak weeks. The 3 first mentioned ferries are sister ships and were tailored for this short route. They use dual command bridges and lack natural prows and sterns and hence never need to turn. Aurora, Hamlet and Tycho Brahe are also built rather low and very wide. The Mercandia IV and Mercandia 8 sister ships were not built especially for this particular route, being vessels of the so-called Superflex type, and have a single bridge. As the bridge is located in the middle of the ship, they also don't need to turn around to change east-west travel direction. Although Mercandia IV and Mercandia 8 look very different from the other 3 ferries, all 5 ferries fit within the same category, which allows fastest possible return time. The crossing takes 20 minutes and the vessels only need 10 minutes in ports of the same ferry regularly departs from both ends of the route inside every hour. Øresund currently uses only the Pendul, a passenger boat for around 200 passengers. A smaller bar is located at its prow and a stern 2 decks are available for passengers. All Scandlines vessels have cafeterias, bars, shops and Aurora also has an additional a la carte restaurant. This isn't intended for travelers, but more for local residents and others who makes one or more immediate return journeys. Double or even triple return voyages are not uncommon. Locally this has spawned a new word, tour or tour, which simply means making at least one return trip for fun. In each city, the ferry terminals are directly connected to the main railway stations. Trains to Copenhagen depart every 20 minutes and arrive after 35 minutes. 2 different local train lines depart from Elsinore station. Both lines end in Hillerød, but one of them takes an indirect path first along the North Zealand coast. From Gilleleje, the tracks turns to the south and pass through Gribstuf, one of Denmark's largest forests. The short route takes 20 minutes to Hillerød, the long route 80 minutes. In Helsingborg, the ferry terminal is connected to an underground railway station. The entire building is known as Knutpunkten, the junction. The total amount of passengers from trains and ferries makes it one of the most busy stations in Sweden. Around 50,000 passengers uses Knutpunkten every day. Helsingborg is located on the Swedish west coast main line, but the first 25 kilometers north of the junction station only consist of a single-track railway, which have some very sharp bends and a steep elevation in the northern part of the city. The interregional Øresund trains departs to Gothenburg, through Landskrona, London, Malmö, across the Øresund Bridge to Copenhagen. Hence it is possible to make a full journey around the Øresund by the use of trains and the HH Ferry route. Local Pagatag also departs from the junction in 4 directions. An important date for the Øresund crossing was the 13th of July 1952, as passports were no longer needed for travel between the Scandinavian countries and Finland. History. Early history where land is seen across the water. Mankind has been able to cross such waters since prehistorical times. There is proof of traveling across the northern part of Øresund from earliest possible historical times, or since the Christianization of the Vikings. The oldest known historical text about travels across Øresund derives from the German history writer Adam of Bremen, who around 1070 wrote, "From Zealand to Scania are many well-used crossings, of which the shortest leads to Helsingborg." Danish and Kalmar Union King Eric of Pomerania introduced the sound dues in 1429. This charge were to be paid to Denmark by every ship that passed through Øresund. They were at the time mainly enforced as a disadvantage to the Hansa, but soon became an important source of income for Denmark for the following hundreds of years. Elsinore became a flourishing and famous town. William Shakespeare unfolded his famous play Hamlet at Elsinore and Kronborg Palace. At the end of medieval times, Kronborg was a fortress, and until 1658 the Danes had a complete view across the narrow northern part of Øresund. It was not only from Kronborg they could watch ships, but also from the tower in Helsingborg, known as Kajnen. The sound dues were to last until 1857, with exception for Swedish ships between 1658 and 1720, when international complaints initiated economic and political agreements. Fishes and ships that crossed the Øresund were not passing through, and were hence not affected by the sound dues. Before 1658, ships could pay the commission both sides of the narrow strait which constitutes the northern part of Øresund. After the Swedish conquest of Scania, the ships which were bound to pay the charges needed to anchor just south of Kronborg Castle, as Sweden had never been allowed to take any dues. The sheltered location just south of Kronborg, where ships anchored in order to pay the sound dues, are the ferry berth of Helsingborg today. Renaissance to 19th century. King Frederick I decided in 1524 that Elsinore would exempt from paying royal taxes, on the condition that his people should be shipped across the route for free. This was a heavy burden on the people of Elsinore during wartime. In 1630 the ferry route was established and a ferry team was created. The size of the ferry crews and the fares were regulated by law. Contrary to other ferries within the Kingdom of Denmark, the Helsingør Færgelag received all rights to sail the route as a vague monopoly. The ferry team was also awarded a part of the sound dues for ships that also used the ferries for parts of the cargo. In 1836 a shipping line began to use the paddle steamer Maria on the route. This wasn't well liked by Helsingør Færgelag, who complained in defense of the 200-year-old privileges. The ferrymen won in court. From 1840, Helsingør Færgelag received a legal monopoly on the route. But times were about to change with the Industrial Revolution. The Helsingør Færgelag continued until 1882, when Christian IX formally abolished the monopoly. However, in practice the monopoly was abandoned already by 1874, as Denmark's largest shipping line at the time had begun to operate on the route. Regular ferry history. From 1874 the monopoly instead went to Det Fornøyd Dampskibsselskab, which probably is more known as DF DFDS. 14 years later, in 1888, private ownership was abandoned, as the Danske Statsbaner, the Danish National Railways, a DSB, took over the service. Although the monopoly was formally abandoned already in 1874, DFDS never attempted to compete with nationally owned DSB. As a railway company, DSB surely was thinking of a train ferry line already from scratch. However, between 1888 and 1892 they only operated the ship Masnedsund, which apart from pedestrian passengers only transported mail. But 4 years later, in 1892, did DSB open its train ferry route. No less than 3 paddle streamers for trains were taken in use. Kronprinsesse Eloise-Thyra, Kronprince Frederick was in operation before the end of the 19th century, and the first ship to use a propeller. Helsingborg was of course also a train ferry. The ferry crossing became a part of the classical train line between Copenhagen and Oslo, and later also night trains to Stockholm. The route was from its beginning a totally Danish matter. First by 1931 did the Swedish counterpart to DSB, Statens Järnvägar or SJ, involved. This was done through a deal which got the label Mitsunds Trafikoverenskomster. DSB and SJ should from this year split all revenues and spending between them equally. The running of the HH Ferry route was however still managed by DSB. During the First World War the southern Øresund was mined by Denmark, Sweden and the German Empire at the request of the latter, but the northern and central parts of Øresund were not affected by this and the traffic could continue. During the Second World War, Denmark, despite the neutrality, became occupied by Germany on the 9th of April 1940, known as Besættelsen in Denmark. In the beginning of this occupation the Germans expected the Danish society to keep working as usual. The ferries continued to sail, but with reduced number of departures. Competing begins. It was first in 1955 that any Swedish shipping line got interested in competing with DSB on the route. It was the bus company Linje Bus AB which from then also became a shipping line. The new ferries become known as Pound. For the 13th of July 1952, passports were no longer needed for traveling between Sweden and Denmark. This was soon extended also to Norway in 1954 and eventually also with an entire Scandinavian countries and Finland. And from the mid-1950s a golden era began as cars had become more common, people could afford holidays, but also pedestrian passengers became more and more common. DSB had the same year as Pound started to compete put the new MF Helsingør on the route and later followed her sister ship MF Helsingborg. Both had dual railway tracks on board, located laterally along the center of the ships. To the left and the right were space for a few cars. Lorries couldn't be shipped together with trains however, but a strange solution for the cafeteria and toilets below car deck made these ferries notably unpopular. However, MF Helsingborg and MF Helsingør became the first ferries on the route which didn't need to turn. Pound challenged DSB with a rather different concept. MS Betula was, despite she was 26 years old when she became first challenger on the route ever in 1955. Betula had a natural prow and stern, and hence needed to turn twice on the way from Helsingør to Helsingborg if the cars, lorries and buses shouldn't need to drive off the ferry backwards. Pound would continue with that concept as long as they sailed the route. In Helsingborg the vehicles drove on board through the stern, and then drive off through the opened prow in Helsingør. The earliest Pound ferries had the cafeterias well above the car deck, which was the difference between watching the sea and perhaps feeling a bit claustrophobic. Helsingør town wasn't too happy about the Swedish privately owned Pound. The main trouble was the increased traffic traffic that drove to the Pound ferries. While the DSB terminal was built together with Helsingbor's main train station, Pound had to build two smaller terminals on the opposite pier, which also was on the small road to Kronborg Palace. The Pound terminals also caused ever-increasing traffic through central Helsingborg and was generally disliked by Helsingbor's local politicians, but the town simply had to accept the competition from Pound. Just 3 years after Pound established the line, in 1958, did Sundbussen, small ships or sound buses, began to operate on the route. Sundbussen made the route all Scandinavian, as they sailed under Norwegian flag, Pound under Swedish ones and DSB under Danish ones. From around 1960, a kind of golden era began at the route. Both shipping lines ordered more and larger ferries. Pound put MS Primula in operation this year. By 1973, Pound had replaced the first two ferries with 4 new ones: MS Corolla 1964, MS Petula 1968, rebuilt in 1985, MS Regular 1971, rebuilt 1985, and MS Ursula 1973, rebuilt 1985. Petula, Regular and Ursula were sister ships, while Corolla externally was a sister ship to MS Dana Scarlet, a ferry that mostly operated on the route between Landskrona and Copenhagen, 25 to 40 kilometers further south. Also, DSB ordered new ferries, larger, more pleasant for passengers, and which could take lorries and trains simultaneously. However, they kept MF Helsingør and MF Helsingborg as well. The 4 sister ships MF Najaden, MF Kronborg, MF Karnen and MF Holgerdanske. By the middle of the 1970s, Pound departed every 20th minute from each port, as with the 4 ferries, DSB every 15th minute with the 6 ferries, and so did the Sundbussen. On top of that, an older ship called Marina sailed every hour from Helsingborg to Snekkasen, just a few kilometers south of Helsingbor's port. In all, 12 departures from Helsingborg every hour during daytime and early evenings. Pound operated also 2 other ferry routes. SL ferries operated at the central part of Øresund, between Landskrona and the northern Copenhagen port, Tuborg, as well as a route from Helsingborg through Copenhagen, Tuborg and Travemünde, Schleswig-Holstein, Federal Republic of Germany. The 3 sister shipping lines were labeled as the Pound SL/TL ferries, where SL meant Skandinavisk Linjetrafik and TL meant Travline. End of the Golden Era. The 1973 energy crisis and higher oil prices affected the Øresund crossing routes. From huge profits, the privately owned shipping lines got financial difficulties. TL Travline was the first to be closed down. This was in 1976. And LB's headquarters in Stockholm decided to move the SL ferries, which had sailed between Landskrona and Copenhagen Tuborg every hour and 90th minute since 1954, to Malmö in an attempt to increase the profits, ended already after 8 months only. In October 1980, LB's headquarters in Stockholm decided to move the SL ferries from Landskrona to Malmö, but they still sailed to Copenhagen Tuborg Danish side. This made the crossing time 20 to 25 minutes longer, and the already existing route between Limhamn and Dragør had a crossing time of just 50 minutes. And already 8 months the SL ferries closed down. The move to Malmö was an obvious mistake. In the following year, 1981, Pound merged with the shipping line which from 1960 had begun to operate in the southern part of Øresund between Dragør and Limhamn. Dampskibsselskabet Øresund A/S, and the new shipping line name became Scandinavian Ferry Lines, or simply SFL, which now operated the HH route as well as the Dragør-Limhamn route. The end of the train ferries. All goods trains were removed from the route in November 1986, as two large goods train ferries began to operate between Helsingborg Harbour's western port and the north port in Copenhagen. The huge goods train ferries were sister ships. The Danish M/F Krona and the Swedish M/S Øresund were operated by Danlink until the opening of the Øresund Bridge in July 2000. But the passenger train line Copenhagen-Oslo continued to be using the DSB ferries across the HH route until the bridge opened 1 July 2000. Ironically, the so-called Lynx trains between the Danish and Norwegian capitals went into bankruptcy a year later. End of competing. In 1984, Helsingborg City Council and the Swedish government decided to replace the city's two railway stations with one. The single track from north was split up underground and connected to the railway from the south. It was also decided to move DSB's ferry terminal to SFL's. The new combined railway station and ferry terminal got the name Knutpunkten, or the junction. Also in Elsinore, SFL's two smaller ferry terminals would be demolished, located at the Kronborg Pier. The SFL terminals had caused a major traffic problem in the Danish town. All ferries from Elsinore should, just like in Helsingborg, leave from one single terminal. And also Elsinore station and ferry terminal was enlarged. The port wasn't expanded for more ferries, but the area just south of Helsingborg is usually calm enough to handle larger ships. Hence a space for two ferries was constructed on the outer side of the southern pier. Towards the end of the old order, DSB finally replaced the U-boats M/F Helsingør and M/F Helsingborg, which both had cafeterias below car deck, with ferries that had sailed on the Great Belt. They were M/F Dronning Ingrid and M/F Dronning Margrethe II. In 1991, when the new ferry terminals were inaugurated, the operators, DSB in cooperation with its Swedish counterpart SJ, and privately owned SFL began to cooperate. This meant the end of competition on the route. Also, the names of the operators changed from DSB and SFL to Scandlines. The Sundbussen still existed, but could only carry pedestrian passengers. The remodeled ferry terminals couldn't handle both SFL's former 4 ferries together with DSB's former 6 ones. Instead, 3 longer and wider ferries were ordered. The first delivered was M/F Tycho Brahe, thereafter M/S Aurora, but the third sister ferry was delayed, as the Danish and Swedish governments had signed the deal to build the Øresund Bridge. In order to maintain the capacity, 2 larger former DSB ferries from Great Belt complemented the Scandline fleet temporarily. M/F Hamlet arrived in the mid-1990s. Acelink and Sundbussen. Sundbussen was sold in the autumn of 2006. The buyers were another Norwegian shipping line, HH Holdings, and by May 2007 was the name shifted to Acelink. In 2008, a large investment in 2 notably bigger passenger ships failed though, and early in 2010 went Acelink in bankruptcy. But soon a new shipping line, Sundbussen AF 2010, was founded and has since used the original shipping line's boat Pernille. The period of renewed competition. After complaints of high prices, Denmark enforced a new law in 1996. According to this law, half of the terminal in Elsinore was expropriated in order to re-establish a second, competing shipping line on the route. Hence could HH ferries begin to compete with Scandlines. In Helsingborg they already had found a location for a new terminal. This was at a distance from the city centre, a remote and far from optimal location for pedestrians. However, for cars and lorries the location didn't pose any problem. HH ferries opened in 1996 using two so-called Superflex ferries, M.F. Mercandia IV and M.F. Mercandia 8. However, after a larger cooperation bought Scandlines and through the purchase of the owners of HH Ferries, suddenly both Scandlines and HH Ferries became two parts of one and the same cooperational group, and the supreme management soon afterwards decided to close HH Ferries again. As of January 2015, Scandlines remains as the single operator of cars and lorries at the route. In 2015, HH ferried 7.4 million passengers, 1.4 million cars, 390,000 lorries and 20,000 buses. Two of the four ferries are scheduled to be converted to full electric propulsion with 4 megawatt-hours batteries each, being recharged from land by a robot when docked. Temporary ID control for travelers to Sweden. The long European Union economic struggle between mainly Germany and Greece ended in a situation which obviously made Greece a poorer country than just a few years back. Greece became a country which no longer could afford the necessary immigration control towards the Turkish border, and from the summer 2015, this fact caused a stream of several hundreds of thousands refugees from mainly Syria and Iraq to enter the EU through Greece, and soon afterwards began searching for good new European Union countries to establish themselves in. But the huge number of refugees arriving to Sweden during the last 4 months of 2015. Further, many of the refugees lacked passports and other documentation, and this in combination with the fear of Islamic terrorists and return of holiday ISIS warriors hiding among the refugees called for Swedish government actions, and in November 2015 it was decided to reintroduce ID papers from 4 January 2016 for entry to Sweden from Denmark and Germany. This control has so far not been evaluated publicly, but the ID control has complicated especially travels by train across the Øresund Bridge. The Øresund Bridge versus HH Ferry route. After Scandlines as new owners of HH Ferries closed the latter shipping line, prices went up for less frequent drivers and the passengers. The single and return prices with Scandlines are almost exactly the same as on the Øresund Bridge. The driving distance, if using the fixed connection, is notably longer though. For people living close to the HH route, return tickets prices equals the single ticket, but the return travel must begin prior to midnight. Lorry and bus companies usually have special deals with Scandlines. List of operators. Helsingborg Färgelaug 1630–1882. Paddle steamer Maria 1836–1840. DFDS 1874–1888. DSB 1888–1991. Pound Lindsey Bus International 1955–1981. Sundbusser 1958–2007. 2010. Acelink 2008–2010. Scandinavian Ferry Lines SFL 1981–91. Scandlines 1991.